the Master began to radiate the glory of God. And who should they encounter while on the mountain but Moses himself? Elijah, the only other character in the Bible to have also ascended Sinai and heard the voice of God speaking to him from on top of Sinai, also appeared on the mountain.
Isn't that interesting? All three of them having been up on Sinai at different times. Let's move to.
I didn't remember that.
Which one, Elijah? Remember when he ran away from Jezebel and slept under the bush and so forth, and the Lord told him, fed him at first, and told him, is that the place? There's two times when I often get his stories mixed up, and he was told to go up to the mountain and hide in the cleft of the rock.
Oh.
And he does, and that's and he listens for the Lord, and he hears the thunder, but the Lord was not in the thunder. And there was a big wind, and the Lord was not in the wind, and then the still small voice.
Isn't that beautiful?
It's a beautiful passage. Have you picked up with the 6 days?
The 6 days may refer to the preliminary period of ritual preparation for occasions of special sanctity, where the touching of holy things or coming into the divine presence requires a period of previous abstinence from anything involving ceremonial defilement. That is to say, the Master and his disciples may have spiritually prepared themselves by fasting and ritual purification for 6 days before their ascent up the high mountain.
All of that just on this idea of after 6 days. Let's go over to page 814, unless you've got anything else that you've marked or want to comment on or talk about. Sharon, on page 814 at the top. Yes.
The Gospels do not indicate the location of the high mountain that the Master chose. Early church tradition places the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, a prominent hill at the eastern end of the Jezreel Valley, not far from Nazareth.
Okay, let's go back over to the map, on page 803, and see if we can spot that. Not far from Nazareth, it said, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Which, and you see where Nazareth is.
Mm-hmm.
So in the previous chapter, we had them up here by Caesarea Philippi with the whole conversation, who do people say that I am? And so if this was on Mount Tabor, consider that they would have left there and gone back over to Mount Tabor, but then the next story after that has them back up in this area near Caesarea Philippi. So the writers here of this material is going to suggest that that's probably not where it was. Although they mentioned that the Byzantine church established that as the official place, and pilgrims have gone there, and there's a church there and so forth. But let's go to the next paragraph, and have you picked it up, Christina? Despite the strong tradition,
the location seems unlikely. In the days of the Master, Mount Tabor was populated and fortified by military installations. The Sanhedrin used Tabor as part of their network of hills on which they lit signal fires to announce the sighting of the new moon.
I underlined that because it related to what we were talking about this morning. Let's drop down to the next paragraph. Keep reading, Christina.
The Gospels place the story of Peter's confession some 45 miles northwest of Mount Tabor in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Although Yeshua could have led his band of disciples down into the Galilee and arrived at Mount Tabor within 6 days, the trip makes no sense and falls outside the gospel narrative. The next geographic note has him entering Galilee after the Transfiguration and arriving in Capernaum at Peter's house.
So there's not a very strong logic. Plus, another part of the logic is his goal was to get them away. You know, he went up on this mountain to be away from civilization and to go right to the place where Rome has a military installation with all the, you know, what is the name of it? And anytime you have a military installation, and then right outside the gate, there's
Century.
Fort?
No, it has to do with all the riff-raff and nasty stuff that always accumulates right outside a gate of a military installation, and there was a term for it that I can't remember what it was now, it's been too long. or the Lord just stamped out nasty stuff I shouldn't remember. The Lord's gonna clean me up in spite of myself. Well, there was certainly plenty of red lights for sure. And it was also the place where they would sell cheap little junket because the soldiers couldn't get it for too far, but they buy keepsakes, little stuff for their family back home.
Bazaar?
No, it's a nastier word than that.
Anyway, but it's still going on.
I'm sure. And I imagine it was going on in the Roman era, where you get, well, it's not what it was called, but flea market is a little different thing. But
Where all the tattoos get done.
the tattoos are there.
I've never been there, but I've seen them.
You were ministering to the people in there.
Oh, that's it.
That's it.
Now I remember.
Let's drop down to the next paragraph, the city of Caesarea Philippi, and who's reading? Deanna?
The city of Caesarea Philippi is at the base of lofty Mount Hermon, and the highest peak in Israel. Mount Tabor stands some 50 miles away, back in the territory of Herod Antipas. The geography of the story suggests that the height of Mount Hermon is the most likely candidate for the location. This does not imply that the Master brought his disciples to the peak of Mount Hermon. Climbing the top of Hermon is, even from the nearest point, an alpine ascent, tiring and fatiguing, which occupied a whole day, 6 hours in the ascent, and 4 in the descent, required provisions of food and water, while from the keenness of the air, it would be impossible to spend the night at the top. Might have merely taken them up into one of the surrounding ridges or partially up one of the slopes of Hermon.
Very good. Yeah, so we don't have alpine, mountaineers here out of the disciples of Jesus, but just going up. And if you've been around mountains, there's always those foothills at the beginning that, you get up there and you're remote, you're in an area all by yourself, you can see some beautiful vistas and so forth. Let's have you pick it up down, skip the next paragraph and pick up with the mountains.
Remote location afforded the Master a private location to bring his disciples. Its magnificent grandeur and awe-inspiring heights provided the appropriate heavenly Sinai environment.
Good. That was short. Go ahead and read the scripture on the next page.
He took Petros, Yohanan, and Yaakov, and went up to the mountain to pray there. Lucas 9:28. The Master went up on the mountain to pray, not to transfigure.
Good. Let's have you pick it up, Janice.
He had a lot to pray about. He already knew that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and to be killed and be raised up on the third day. Matthew 16:21. He climbed the high mountain to spend the time in prayer, seeking guidance and further revelation. He brought his 3 closest disciples with him because he knew that his words about his impending suffering and death concerning them. Perhaps he hoped that the Lord might confirm their confessions of faith in his messianic identity and offer them some revelation as well.
Let's consider, go ahead, finish that sentence and then I'll back in.
A night spent in a prayer vigil with those selected 3 disciples foreshadows the night of prayer on Mount of Olives.
And just like on Mount of Olives, they fall asleep. But I thought it was interesting that they said here that he did not go up the mountain to be transfigured or to transfigure. He went to pray. And that one of the things he's praying about is that this beautiful profession of faith that Peter makes, that you are the Messiah. And then he says, yeah, that's right, now I'm going to die. It's like that, they're not going to be ready to wrap their brains around that. And so part of his prayer is praying through their human limitations of receiving the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. Let's drop down through skip the next paragraph and let's have you pick it up, Marina.
At some point,
Mm-hmm.
At some point while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. Luke 9:29. The master was caught up in the presence of God, and the disciples beheld him in the divine.
Good.
Is that right?
Yes. I'm looking here at this next paragraph and thinking, Florine, that it captures that word you were looking for. A metamorphosis is the process of substantially changing or transfiguring from one physical state to another. So both are physical states. So it's not from the physical state to a spiritual or a non-metaphysical, I think, which would be outside of physical. It's more of a metamorphosis from one physical state to another physical state.
Like a caterpillar and a butterfly.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. I was thinking like water to, like ice to water to steam.
Yeah.
They're all a physical form. Good. Okay, let's go ahead and, again, this is not such a long chapter that if there's things you want to be sure that we cover, we do. Otherwise, let's go over to 8:16 and take a look at these Eliyahu and Moshe. You know, I wish that we used Elijah's name as Eliyahu because it's so much easier to keep Eliyahu separate from Elisha. And I always have trouble keeping Elijah and Elisha straight. Do you too?
I have a serious problem with it.
Yeah. Where Eliyahu is easy to keep separate. Okay, then let's go down to, and we'll read the scripture, Chris, and then I'm going to have you jump a paragraph.
Remember the Torah of Moses, my servant.
Wait a minute, where are you? I'll go to Eliyahu
No,
and
then
Moshe and read the
Moshe.
scriptures.
See, now I have to say that Moshe appeared to them, and they were speaking with Yeshua.
Good, skip 2 paragraphs and take it up with innocence.
In a sense, Moses and Elijah might represent the Torah and the prophets respectively. Moses wrote the Torah and Elijah acted as the quintessential prophet. According to that interpretation, Moses and Elijah represent the testimony of the Hebrew Bible. The Master referred to the dual testimony of the Torah and the prophets frequently. For example, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all Scripture. Luke 24:27.
Go ahead and do that, the next little short
As
one.
mentioned above, Moses and Elijah also share a common experience on Mount Sinai with the voice of God. Both climbed Mount Sinai. Both heard God speak in the mountaintop.
So this idea that the two of them showing up represents that the Torah is supporting Jesus, is supporting him as the Messiah, and the prophets, all the prophets are supporting him as Messiah. Just kind of cool.
Yes, it is.
Continue, skip 2 paragraph or 1 paragraph in the scripture and pick it up, sharing the apocalyptic tradition.
The apocalyptic tradition of the early believers seemed to expect Moses and Elijah to come during the turbulent period of the messianic birth pains. 2 witnesses wielding the power of Moses and Elijah appear to herald the second coming in Revelation chapter 11. The combination of Moses who died and Elijah who did not die constitutes testimony from both the living and the dead. Ooh, interesting. Messiah is Lord, both of the dead and of the living. Hey, that's our next scripture in Bible Study Fellowship,
Yeah.
which is puzzling. There's a lot of puzzling things in Romans chapter 14.
Yeah.
Questions that I have.
Yeah, there's a lot of strange, Paul, some of the teachers from First Fruits of Zion say, Paul is hard to understand, and I say, oh, thank you, I'm so glad somebody thinks so beside me.
Yes, that's why I'm taking it. That's why I wanted to take Bible Study Fellowship, because I thought I'd get one. And it has helped, but still, it's still kind of way out there.
Well, and it's a little scary because without a good, until you have resolved some of the Torah issues, The, until you have resolved and stabilized that Torah is legitimate, God wrote it, it's still in existence, God hasn't changed everything that God said and has done before, He continues to do. Until you get that resolved, it's easy to take some of the passage of Romans and go off in some new strange direction.
In our Western mind thinking,
Right, and only,
English only.
right, and only when you realize, wait a minute, if it's true that Paul is saying what it sounds like Paul is saying, then that means that, you know, he's upturning something of Torah, and he can't do that. And when he was arrested, they charged him with doing that, and they never found evidence to substantiate it. He said himself that he was not removing any part of Torah and so forth. And therefore, he can't be saying what it sounds like he's saying, and then you have to start looking for something
The significant
else.
part about Romans is, if Paul says it once, he says it, I don't know how many times. God did not, Jesus did not come to destroy the law. And he has said that, you know, and he says, does this negate the law? And he keeps saying, by no means, by no
Heaven
means,
forbid.
by no, yeah.
Absolutely not.
And that's what drives home, is that the Torah is the Torah, and just because it's in the Old Testament doesn't mean it's done away
Diminished
with
in any way.
at
Right.
all. That's the one good truth that comes
Okay,
out of Romans.
let's go ahead. Where are we?
Moses died.
Okay, good. Is it your turn or is it Christina? It's Christina.
Moses died on Mount Nebo, and the Lord buried him in the land of Moab. In what form did the dead Moses appear at the Transfiguration? The resurrection of the righteous has not yet occurred, so one cannot say that Moses appeared in his resurrected state. The Gospels do not report the Transfiguration story as a prophetic vision or dream. Instead, Moses and Elijah actually do stand and converse with the Master. The reader must allow Moses to have appeared as a spiritual entity, disembodied yet recognizable in a human form. Was this his first entry into the Promised Land?
Yeah, Pastor Hagee always teaches that when he stood on Mount Nebo and looked in and saw everything and wanted so badly to go in, that, and God didn't allow it, but that God had something better planned. He put him in the land on the mountain Transfiguration.
Well, the first sentence, Moses died on Mount Nebo, has a footnote. They're saying that maybe Moses never did taste death.
You know, I've often wondered that. I mean, although the scripture says that he died on Mount Nebo, all we know is that God took him up there and wouldn't tell anybody where his body was, so that they wouldn't go and,
It says,
Yeah.
like, he never tasted death. They believe he never tasted death.
yeah, you wonder if God didn't just take him home from there and didn't bother to explain it to us.
Yeah.
You guys aren't ready for that. But in any case, we have here, a part of that conversation we were having earlier, that it wasn't a resurrected body he had, because the resurrection of the dead hadn't taken place. He was recognizable, he was visible, you know, you could see him. So it wasn't just a vapor or
There's another dimension. They're in another dimension.
yeah. Go ahead and let's pick up the next paragraph.
Elijah? Elijah, on the other hand, did not taste death, but ascended into the sky in a whirlwind. But he never died. He continued to make cameo appearances in Jewish literature and folk tales. The Spirit of the Lord might take him up and cast him off a mountain. 2 Kings 2:16. One never knows when Elijah might show up. Jewish families have placed him at the Passover Seder table and reserved a chair in a reserve
Yeah, skip that first
for
name.
him and reserve a chair for him at every circumcision ritual.
Yeah, because he complained to the Lord that he was the last faithful person in Israel, and that there were no more after him. And the Lord said, I got 7,000 more just like you. And because of that he's been required to show up at the breast of every single baby ever born. You know, the Lord can do much. Also at Sukkot, tabernacle, the time of tabernacles, when people build their sukkahs, one of the things that they're supposed to do is pray and prepare that God might send Elijah to visit them. And so they always make sure they have plenty extra for Elijah. He's going to be hungry after all the years he's been gone. Let's have Florian pick it up in rabbinic literature.
Jewish folklore and the tales of the
Hasidim.
Elijah often appears to a rabbi or sage to impart a revelation. Likewise, he appeared at the time of the Transfiguration. Moses and Elijah did not appear simply to endorse Yeshua or impress the disciples. They came to relay important information to the Master.
That just blows my mind. I mean, Jesus is God in the flesh. We think of him as knowing everything. What possible information could Elijah and Moses have that he didn't already know? And so that would clearly suggest that even though he was God in the flesh, that as he took on that flesh, he also set aside omniscience. He set aside knowing all things.
What I was thinking is that since he knows all things, perhaps they were focusing him in on a special message that God had for them to give them, to know all things.
But I mean, he spent all this time in prayer, and in prayer wouldn't God have already popped that knowledge in his head? I don't know either, but clearly not, clearly not. Clearly in God's economy,
They came to relay
important information. He knew that he had, well, I think they do go on and explain a little bit of it here.
On our Master Yeshua Klein, in that paragraph explains it.
And where's that, Deanna?
On page 818.
Yeah, we're getting ready to read it right now. Let's go ahead and, Janice, I think, let's have you pick it up. Then two men were speaking, start at the top.
Then two men were speaking with him, Moshe and Elihu. They appeared in their glory and told.
I'm sorry, I got it wrong.
Elihu. They appeared in their glory and told of his end, which would be fulfilled in
Jerusalem.
Luke 9:30-31. Our Master Yeshua climbed the high mountain seeking revelation about the path of suffering that he knew he must take. Since hearing of the death of John the Immerser, he had avoided the Galilee. He brought his disciples into
Phoenicia,
Decapolis, and
Betania.
Betania, outside of the reaches of Herod Antipas. He knew that his own life was following the same trajectory as John's, and that his own end was coming soon. He knew that the thing, whatever it was, must take place in the holy city of Jerusalem. He did not know when or how or what course he should take. He needed more information.
And that kind of it carries it out. But it sure messes up our theology that as the Son of God, he already knew all things. But it doesn't diminish at all. I mean, if anything, it makes when he, in his pre-existence, was with the Father in heaven and had the choice, I think, to lay down what it was to be one with the Father, to go on this journey where for the first time in eternity he was separated, his being was separated out from the Holy Father in heaven, and to live in this minimal, I mean, imagine if the Lord, and let's take a real flight of fantasy. Let's say that the Lord is concerned, so concerned, about the end of all the cockroaches on earth. that they're all going to be destroyed. In a huge nuclear blast, all the cockroaches of Earth are going to be destroyed. But if a message can come through to the cockroaches that they have a chance of survival if they do whatever thing you want to come up with. And he asks each of us if we're willing to come down and be a cockroach, to take off everything it is to be who we are and become a cockroach and walk around among the cockroaches to send this message. I mean, I think that this thing of God, Jesus, the very essence of God, taking off his Godhead, taking off his essence, and just letting a little sliver of himself be born physically as a human being with all the limitations, with all the temptations. It says that he experienced all the temptations, but he sinned not. I think that we sometimes don't, I don't know if we can wrap our brain around what that is. I wrote a little children's book one time about a little boy who loved the ants and the way they built and everything, and they were getting in the house. And the father told him that he was going to spray. He heard his parents talking about spray and get rid of all the ants. And the little boy has he hates to see these ants get destroyed like this. And so he becomes a little ant and goes among the ants to tell them to keep their nests out further away from the house so they don't get killed. And the ants think he's crazy to be talking like he knows something that the rest of them don't, and they tear him apart. And Chris, it's been my effort back in the days when I taught children, and to help them understand this idea of what it was for Christ to come down to earth. Anyway, okay, we didn't need to do all that at all. So where were we? So he set his face toward Jerusalem. No, did we get that far?
When
Wow, and Daniel.
The Daniel the prophet requests revelations.
Oh, yeah, good. Let's pick it up from there.
When Daniel the prophet requested revelation, the Lord dispatched the angel Gabriel to provide him with the answers to his questions. In the master's case, the Lord did not send an angel to deliver the message. He sent only his two most trusted and loyal messengers to deliver the message through Yeshua.
Good, please.
Moses and Elijah came to speak to the master about his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem, Mark 9:31. Luke's word choice implies more than just the master's impending death. The Greek exodus alludes the Septuagint book of Exodus and the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Moses and Elijah explained to Yeshua that his personal Exodus would take place at Passover, the annual commemoration of the Exodus.
Let's go back up into that scripture. I put a note and I couldn't remember why I put it. Back up in the Lucas 9:30-31 at the top of the page. They appeared in his glory and told of his end, which would be fulfilled in Jerusalem, told of his exodus that would be fulfilled. And who more appropriate to talk about an exodus than Moshe
I
himself?
was going to say Moses.
Go ahead, continue.
They explained the path of suffering he must follow, but they also explained his exodus from the grave and his ascension. After his conversation with Moses and Elijah, the master returned to Galilee without any further fear of Herod Antipas, and he set his face towards Jerusalem and his exodus there.
Very good. Let's go to the next page, 819. Have you picked it up, Sharon?
Wide awake.
Uh-huh.
and those with him were in a deep sleep and then awoke. They saw his glory and the two men who were standing with him. Luke 9. That night, while the master prayed through the long hours, Simon, Peter, James, and John could not fight off sleep. Their eyes were very heavy, as they would later do it in Gethsemane. They fell asleep with Yeshua while Yeshua prayed. They slept, unaware of his transfiguration in the presence of Moses and Elijah, until they awoke. Then they saw his glory. The darkness of the night around them had transformed to dazzling light. And behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah. They appeared in glory with the Master. Luke 9. The disciples did not need any introductions. Somehow, by means of some soulish spiritual recognition, they knew at once that they looked upon Moses and Elijah.
Christina?
With the
Petros.
Petros responded and said to Yeshua, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 sukkot, one for you, one for Moshe, and one for Eliyahu. For he did not know what to say, since they were terrified. The 3 disciples heard only the end of the conversation. The visitors indicated that the conversation was at an end. As these were leaving him, Simon Peter offered to build shelters for his rabbis and the 2 exalted guests.
Let's go over to page.
Peter, don't you love him?
Yeah, but I love the
He's
explanation
funny.
over here on 820. This helped me
Oh,
make
okay.
sense of it.
All
On 820, in the second paragraph, Deanna, can you pick that up here?
Simon Peter's offer intended no cryptic symbolism. He only wanted to prolong the moment. Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Rabbi, it is good for us to be here, he said. He offered to build the booths as a gesture of hospitality. He imagined himself gathering some branches and foliage from nearby trees and creating the type of sukkah in which he and the other disciples were accustomed to sleeping during their travels with the Master. Many times when night had overtaken them on the road, they had put together shelters from the available materials and spent the night. Simon Peter had probably made many such booths for his rabbi. In retrospect, the offer seemed foolish to him, as if Moses and Elijah need some places today.
But I had not realized, every time I've read it, I've thought in terms of the Feast of Tabernacle. And
Same
why
here.
would he think about doing, it's not, was it like in the fall, but they're on their way to Jerusalem for Passover, so it can't be in the fall, so it just seemed so totally
Out of place.
out of place. Yeah, inconsistent. But when we realize that sukkah, the word is only used in a generic sense of any kind of temporary dwelling. I mean, they didn't have Motel 6 you could stop at, you know,
Right.
and so any kind of little bit of shelter. And he was just, and it had been his pleasure to do that for Rabbi a lot of times, for Jesus a lot of times. So he was just thinking in terms of, you know, oh, don't go away, we'll build you a little sukkah, you can spend the night, kind of thing. And then later realizes that it sounds pretty foolish. Let's go down to the cloud. Who was it that said just recently that year, it was one of the Jewish rabbis that I listened to, said something about, there's one of the, it was Dennis Prager has written a book called The Common Sense Gospel or something like that, or the Common Sense Bible. And he says that it's clear that the Bible is written by God because the writer doesn't make the Jews look good. That if the Jews had written the Bible, they would have cleaned up the stories about themselves a whole lot. But the very fact that they're look pretty ragged is
Our
evidence.
rabbi said that once too.
Did
Yeah,
Let's pick
because
up.
he's doing this.
Yeah, the thing is,
I love that, man.
Let's pick it up with the cloud and Florine.
Before Simon Peter was finished speaking,
Go up and read the scripture.
a cloud was covering them, and from the cloud a voice came.
Now, I put a little note there that God had provided his own sukkah in the cloud.
Yes.
Before Simon Peter even finished speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed Yeshua, Moses, and Elijah. The disciples watched in terror as the Master and the 2 visitors disappeared in the bright, swirling mist of cloud. In the Torah, the bright cloud conceals the Shekinah, the glory of the Lord. It leads Israel in the wilderness, descends on Mount Sinai, and settles upon the tabernacle.
Good, let's let that go and move over to page 821 and pick it up with the voice and Janice.
And from the clouds a voice came forth saying, This is my dear son, listen to him. Mark 9:7. From out of the cloud a voice spoke, echoing like thunder on the mountain. In our days, it is uncommon and even exceedingly rare to hear a voice speaking from heaven. According to rabbinic sources, the voice from heaven spoke more frequently in the apostolic era.
Now, notice that this is from rabbinic sources, not from the gospel writers. Keep going.
The Hebrew term for a heavenly voice is
Bak-kol.
bak-kol.
Try to remember that, because as you get more and more into Hebrew studies, you'll encounter Bak-kol. Keep reading.
Bak-kol literally means daughter of the voice, a way to describe an echo of reverberation.
Echo or reverberation.
Echo or reverberation. The Talmud uses the term to refer to a voice heard from the unseen speaker. The term is rabbinic, shorthand for a longer form, the sound of a voice. Bak-kol proceeded from heaven. The Gospel records two other incidents involving a voice speaking from heaven. Paul also heard a voice from heaven speak to him, as did the writer of the book of Revelation.
Very good. Thank you. And let's have you pick it up, Marina.
The voice from heaven essentially repeated the same message which the Master heard at the time of his immersion in the Jordan. In that instance, the voice addressed Yeshua directly, saying, "You are my son." On the high mountain, the voice addressed the disciples, "This is my beloved son." And the message came with the additional imperative, "Listen to him."
Keep going.
All three synoptic gospels report the words of the voice slightly different. In his second epistle, the Apostle Peter also recorded a version of the words he heard on the Holy Mountain.
Let's take a look at these three. Let's have each of you read one at a time. Chris, start with you under Matthew 17:5.
This is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.
This is my beloved son, listen to him.
This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him.
This is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased.
Okay, so now what we're going to do is take each of these and read a little paragraph. I think we're okay on time. Yeah, we should be good.